Yes, I can also record on my own too. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Grazing and Pasture Management in Pennsylvania, Available Resources for Good Practices. I'm Cheryl Burns, the Project and Outreach Manager for Capital RC&D. Quickly, while we wait for a few people to come in yet, I'll provide a brief introduction. So Capital RC&D is a nonprofit organization that networks people, resources, and projects to promote responsible use and conservation of natural, community, and economic resources in South Central Pennsylvania. Much of our work benefits farmers and other private landowners, including graziers, through our grazing support program. This webinar is part of that program and specifically a component of a project funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and held in collaboration with the Stroud Water Research Center and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So this webinar contains 4 main sections: an overview of management issues, benefits of pasturing livestock, agency support and types of assistance, and then finally we'll have a question and answer period. Other than the presenters, we'll keep everybody on mute, but you can ask questions at any time using the chat box. We'll likely hold those questions until the question and answer period at the end of the webinar, and we'll use the chat box for questions then as well. The chat box, if you're not familiar, on my screen, it might be different on yours, is located on the bottom. You'll see several options. You'll see where you can mute yourself, start video, which we're not using video, and you should maybe already be on mute, and we'll just keep everyone on mute, like I said. The participants, the chat box, which if you click will pull up a separate box where you can just type in your questions. If needed, we can respond that way, or we can communicate those questions to presenters. And there may be several other viewing options as well. For example, with this type of software, often you'll see small boxes that represent each speaker or each participant that's in the meeting or webinar. And luckily we have a feature, mine is in the upper right-hand corner of my screen, that says view. And when you select that, you can click a full screen option that takes away those speaker boxes, you know, the avatars or what normally would be a little video of the people. That may provide the best viewing experience for you. So Susan Richards, Capital RC&D's Executive Director, and I will be monitoring chat and able to assist if you have any technical issues throughout the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on both the Capital RC&D YouTube channel, as well as the grazing support page on capitalrcd.org. And Susan, next slide, please. One more. Thank you. Sorry. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters, who are also Capital RC&D Grazing Advisors. And in that capacity, they're also available for one-to-one grazing consultations within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, Pennsylvania. Our first presenter, Donna Foulk, lives in Northeast Pennsylvania and has a passion for horses. Prior to joining Capital RC&D's Grazing Advisor team, she worked with Rutgers University and then Penn State Extension as an educator focused on field crops, forages, and working with the equine industry. Our second presenter, Ann Basehore, lives in South Central Pennsylvania. She grew up on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, but didn't start grazing until she had her own farm and cheese-making operation in Massachusetts. She started with dairy cows and later transitioned to dairy goats, eventually authoring the Dairy Goat Handbook.
Sure. in print, right?
Okay. Donna, at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl.
Oh.
Whoops, all right.
I'm sorry, I missed, sorry. Susan, can we go back one? Thank you. I apologize. So Capital RC&D's Grazing Advisor program started in 2008 to provide individualized one-to-one or more specifically farmer-to-farmer support for farmers within the Chesapeake Bay watershed in Pennsylvania. The program is currently supported by 4 grazing advisors, both Donna and Ann, Titus Martin, and Dwayne Hertzler. Together, they have over 90 years of experience managing dairy, beef, small ruminants, and horses. The grazing advisors are available to provide technical assistance relating to pasture management improvements, fencing, grazing planning, weed management, soil health, forage species selection, livestock issues, and other grazing-related topics. So who should use this program? A key feature of the program is that it's designed to meet a grazer at their own experience level. So it's an excellent resource for new farmers and experienced grazers, regardless of whether they're just getting started or if they've been grazing for years and want to transition to a different grazing system. So thanks to a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, there's no cost for these consultations. There's additional information about the program and other grazing support on our website, capitalrcd.org/grazing support. If you have questions or are interested in working with a grazing advisor, contact Susan Richards. Her contact information is on our website and also included in a handout we'll provide after the webinar. Donna and Ann are our newest grazing advisors, and it's been a pleasure to work with them in developing this webinar. And I'd like to thank both of you for agreeing to help and for sharing your knowledge today. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Donna Foulk, who'll provide an overview of management issues. Donna?
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. I want to explain first that this webinar is really designed to help you identify what you need to know to effectively manage your pastures and grazing animals. There's just simply not enough time in one webinar to discuss each topic in detail, but understanding what you need to know is really a good first step. And the last section of this webinar is going to provide you with a list of resources and agencies that can offer more detailed information that will help you. So I'll be covering the section on managing pastures. Those of you that know me know that's a topic I really enjoy, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have at the end. So what do you need to know about managing pastures? So I'm going to start with the most important thing, which is the forages themselves. You know, to the untrained eye, all forages may look the same. A pasture may look like it's just composed of one particular type of grass. But a healthy pasture should be composed of many forage species and types of forages. It is important to know how these forages grow and how each forage species differs. There are many types of forages. Grasses and legumes are the most common, but forbs, edible weeds, and small grains can also serve as a forage for livestock. As Ann reminds me, even brush can be an edible fiber source if you're pasturing goats. Most permanent pastures are composed of grasses or legumes. A really important management distinction that you should know is that legumes such as clover and alfalfa do not need applications of nitrogen to maximize growth, since they are able to fix nitrogen in the air and soil and utilize it for growth. Grasses absolutely need nitrogen applications or manure. Failure to provide nitrogen will promote the proliferation of legumes like clover. Adding nitrogen fertilizer or manure as a nitrogen source will increase the growth of grasses in your pasture. Forages can vary in terms of nutritional composition as well. Alfalfa is a legume that produces extremely high quality forage. and requires careful management for livestock consumption. Perennial ryegrass tends to be high in carbohydrates that can be wonderful to maximize weight gain, but may not be the best choice for horses. In general, grasses maintained in a healthy vegetated state by mowing or grazing at proper heights and intervals are just an extremely wonderful source of nutrition for animals. It's also important to know that most of our grass species, whether we're talking about timothy, perennial rye, brome, fescue, orchard grass, bluegrass, they're cool season grasses. They grow very well when temperatures are cool, but growth slows in summer. So a great deal of damage can occur to a pasture that's heavily grazed during hot, dry conditions. It's very important to learn to identify grasses, and it can be fun too, to determine what kind of grass species is present in your pasture. They're all different. The attributes and limitations of each species will vary. Some grass species like timothy have poor drought tolerance. Some like canary grass are more tolerant of low pH soils and wet conditions. Some survive close grazing and heavy use better than others. For example, bluegrass is a sod-forming grass that can tiller and fill in bare spots. It can tolerate close grazing because it stores its energy under the ground. Many grasses like orchard grass and timothy are bunch grasses. And although they can increase in size, they cannot send out rhizomes to create new plants. They store energy above ground in the lower 3 inches of the plant, so intense grazing can prevent closely grazed plants from growing back. So when choosing a forage species, make sure you're thinking about your own management style and the number of animals that you have, as well as your climate and soil conditions. The final consideration is to be sure that your pasture is composed primarily of permanent grass rather than annuals. Annual grasses like crabgrass and foxtail are not present early in spring, and they'll die after a frost. They have to grow each year from seed, and so they're not present to absorb excess nutrients and prevent erosion in late fall, winter, and spring. So you can see that all grasses are not alike. It's important, and like I said, can be fun to learn to identify forages. There are many great resources to help you, and many are listed on the RC&D website. So how can you tell your pastures need help? Well, pastures don't fail overnight. It might look like they do, but they don't. It happens over time. So it's important that you survey your pastures often to look for signs that help is needed. Unhealthy pastures generally contain short, small plants that have poor regrowth and often have poor color. The pasture contains many bare spots where the plants have been eliminated. Unfortunately, weeds usually fill in those bare spots and can quickly dominate a pasture. So, what do you need to know about soil and fertility? Again, this is just a basic introduction. Healthy soil is wonderful. It's high in organic matter, it's pliable, not compacted, is able to hold nutrients and water, and make those things available to plants. It's a living soil that contains soil insects, arthropods, worms, and decay bacteria. And Anne is talking much more about healthy soils and livestock in the next section. So let's talk very briefly about plant nutrients. The three main nutrients that plants obtain from soil are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen enhances chlorophyll production, makes plants a beautiful green color, and increases their size and productivity. It's very important to grasses. Phosphorus and potassium are important in root development, and they will increase the plant's ability to survive disease and stress. Proper fertility is extremely important in maintaining healthy, high-quality plants, and it's oftentimes overlooked. Maintaining proper soil pH is critical. Forages perform well at soil pH levels between 6 and 7. Acidic soils limit the ability of soil nutrients and greatly restrict plant growth. pH is critical, maintaining a proper pH. You know, farms as well as individual fields on farms can vary greatly in soil nutrient levels and pH. It's really important to perform soil tests on the pastures on your farm. Penn State Extension and many analytical laboratories supply kits and directions on how to collect and submit soil. The lab will supply complete soil analysis and document levels of N, P, and K, as well as soil pH. And the lab will provide recommendations for applications of these nutrients as well as lime. It's the only way to know what your pastures really need. So what do you need to know about weeds? Next slide, Susan. All right, I happen to really find weeds extremely interesting, and there's a lot of good things I can say about them. But they can be a serious problem in pastures because they compete with desirable forages for space, nutrient, light, and water. And some weeds, if digested, are toxic and can be harmful or even fatal to animals. It's important to note that what is considered a weed for one livestock species may be a source of nutrition for another. For example, cows can eat plantain and other weeds that a horse simply will not touch. The most important thing I can say about weeds is that they rarely outcompete healthy pasture grasses. But they can quickly take over if pastures are not managed to ensure a thick stand of healthy forage. When addressing weed problems, it's important to properly identify the weeds. Annual weeds are managed differently than perennial ones. Annual weeds are incredible seed producers. One ragweed plant can produce 3,400 seeds in a growing season, pigweed 117,000. So it's not surprising that they can seem to take over a pasture overnight. Perennial weeds like curly dock, horse nettle, and milkweed return every year and can be particularly challenging. I'm often asked about pasture herbicides as an effective tool, and it can be at times. They're not extremely easy to use in the sense that you need to know something about the weeds and the herbicide. Herbicides can be selective. They can control some weeds and not others. So you will need to learn to identify the weeds by species. They have label restrictions that you have to carefully adhere to. I really feel it's best to contact an extension educator or a consultant if you plan to use herbicides. If you're going to do that, if you have no other option available, make sure you're using the right product at the right time and only when you have to. And remember that herbicides alone, they just simply don't offer a permanent solution to weed problems. They create a bare spot that if you don't correct the problems that cause the pasture to fail, will just be filled in by another weed. So it's really more important to correct the problem, get the grasses healthy so they can compete with the weed species. So how do we keep forages healthy and thick so that weeds have no place to grow? I can't say enough about the importance of rest and rotation that allow pasture plants time to restore the energy they need to grow back after they're grazed. Repeated intense grazing depletes energy reserves and eventually will kill a plant. Sometimes as much as being grazed to the ground twice is enough to eliminate that forage species. And animals graze differently. Animals like cows and sheep graze uniformly across the pasture. Some, like horses, tend to selectively graze, and they can eliminate all the plants in one area, and they will. Some animals have teeth that allow them to graze right at ground level. Some graze higher up on the plant. Pasture systems can support higher stocking densities when rotational paddocks are utilized. It's so important. There are many agencies and grazing advisors that can help you get started and develop a system that works for your farm. Animal concentration areas can be used also to provide additional protection for pasture forage. They're not just bare ground, they're actually engineered areas that use stone aggregate as a base, geotextile material, and topped with finer stone dust. You can see one here in the top picture. They're sloped to allow nutrients to run into vegetative areas. They're safe for the animals, and they're wonderful because they can be used to remove animals from pastures during periods of adverse growing conditions, like wet, muddy spring, drought, hot, dry summers. And they can also be used if animal stocking rates become too high for the pastures to support. They can successfully get your pastures through hard times. So you think you're doing everything right, but your pasture is a mess. So how do you fix it? Okay, Susan, next slide. Okay, there may come a time when your pasture needs to be reseeded or renovated. It's important first to address the problems that cause the pasture to fail. Did you have too many animals? That's often an issue. Was soil fertility and pH poor? Was weed pressure too high? You will need to make sure you have a plan to rest the pasture and prevent overgrazing and keep the new pasture healthy. You don't want to have to fix them again. It's too expensive. It takes too much time. Decide which forage will work best on your farm, considering your animal numbers, soil conditions, and your ability to manage the pasture. What's really important is to decide how you will reseed your pasture. Just broadcasting seed wastes money, and it's rarely effective for grass forages. Seed needs good seed to soil contact to germinate. Just broadcasting just simply lays it on the surface of the ground. So one really neat option is this: if you can find a no-till drill, it's just a wonderful piece of equipment that will actually meter out the seed, press it into the soil, creating the soil seed contact that the seed needs, and creates these wonderful rows of new forage species like you see in the picture here. Looks like little tiny corn plants growing almost, but it's actually forage. That's a drill in the upper corner that's pulled behind a tractor, and you can get them in all sizes, so you don't need a monstrously big tractor to pull one. Some conservation districts have drills available for rent, and farmers will occasionally drill pastures for a neighboring farm. Many pastures have been seeded creatively using a disc to break up the soil, a broadcast seeder, and then late harrowing after seeding. So be creative. Just try to get that seed very, very lightly covered with soil. Fall is usually the preferred time for reseeding. Early spring seedings can be effective, but there generally is more weed seed competition in spring. And remember that animals should not be allowed to graze the new seeding until the grass is at least 6 inches tall and the roots are well established. This could take 6 months to a year. Some states actually recommend 2 years before animals are returned to a newly seeded pasture. Okay, next slide. All right, so in summary, I think to me the most important thing is just being observant. Walk your pastures often. It's good for both you and your animals. Learn to love identifying forages and weeds. That's important so that you know what's in your pasture. I like to keep records of pasture composition so you actually know when it changes. Seek out help and resources that provide good research-based information. And work hard to maintain a productive pasture. It is just so much easier to maintain one than to repair a pasture that's deteriorated or reestablish a new one. Okay, now Ann is I'm gonna turn this over to Ann so that she can talk about livestock and pastures.
Thank you, Donna. I'm going to continue the discussion by adding livestock to the pasture and talk about the many benefits received from doing this. We'll touch briefly on 4 areas: animal health, profitability, soil health, and a positive environmental impact. So looking at animal health, foraging and grazing animals optimize the nutrients that plants have to offer. Why is this important? Better nutrients build a strong animal, an active immune system, and in the case of ruminants, encourages a healthy rumen. While stored feeds, silage, and hay are important components of a feeding system, there is nutrient loss and alteration as soon as the plant is cut. Grazing offers livestock the opportunity to forage the plant and immediately put these nutrients in their bodies. Secondly, forbs and forages contain vitamins, micronutrients, and flavonoids that can be lost in the preservation process of ensiling and drying for hay. These nutrients are important for improved animal health and productivity, as well as product quality. And thirdly, animal movement through the fields and forage area are positive for the musculoskeletal strength, agility, and overall health of the animals. Just as we humans strive for healthy movement and exercise, farm animals also thrive with natural movement in their environment. A natural course of action is for animals to move, foraging for their own food, and then rest. And this is especially true for ruminants, cows, sheep, and goats, as the resting time allows the animal ruminants to bacteria and muscle contractions, as well as cud chewing, allows it to break down the plant cellulose and release those nutrients. Also, when you're looking at animal movement, it's good for their animals' feet, legs, hips to be out in properly managed fields, grasses, and woodlands. Especially true for horses, alpacas, and llamas. They really thrive with this exercise, and it's really what their bodies are meant to be doing. So these are some of the benefits of that the livestock receive from being out on pasture. It really is just great for their health of their bodies. Next. We're looking at profitability. As we just talked about healthier animals. Healthier animals are less expensive to raise. So you see a reduction in your veterinary costs, and also healthier animals are more productive. So an increase in your income. So when you see a reduction in expenses and an increase in income, that is really a bonus for your farm business bottom line. Also, right now, there's a high demand for pasture-raised products. Consumers are looking for the pasture-raised products. Meat, milk, dairy products, eggs, and these products generally of higher price per pound is often attached to these pasture-raised products. If you're doing direct marketing, you can see an increased demand for local foods and food with a story. As you can see from this slide, you have pictures like with your animals out on pasture with healthy, strong animals out on the green grass. And customers really want to be a part of that story. They want to support your farm and be a customer enjoying that pasture-raised products. Thirdly, when you're feeding fresh forages, your animals are out foraging, it offers an opportunity to reduce feed costs. You can use your land-based natural elements of sun, energy, and precipitation with the animals foraging, and that equals a lower feed inputs. Also, as we're seeing bedding costs are rising, and with your animals out on a pasture for say 8 or 9 months anyway, you definitely get a decrease in these bedding costs, and that is a bonus for your bottom line. And while there are startup and working costs of a grazing system, the necessary equipment is less expensive than other feeding systems. Some of the costs that you're going to incur, incur are fencing, water systems, shade, seeding, soil fertility, as Donna talked about. You're going to be having to mow your pastures. That's one thing, is you have to go in a couple times during the growing season and mow down the pastures. And then also the labor to set up and move animals. But generally speaking, these expenses for a grazing system are going to be less than other feeding systems. And lastly, as far as profitability, we find that animals on pasture, you have a healthier and more productive soil. So you're going to be spending less money for the external inputs of fertilizer and soil amendments. Next, please. So as we talked about with soil, thinking back to the profitability, we see a natural and efficient soil fertilization with animal manure and urine as livestock are properly rotated through a pasturing system. Smaller size paddocks and frequent movement decreases the time that animals are congregating in one area and manure is more evenly distributed. As I said, it is important to be moving these animals frequently so that you don't get a congregation or a concentration of manure. There is growing evidence that animals on fields with proper management is a benefit to the soil health. And one thing that's been hearing talk about is that crop farmers are working with livestock farmers to bring animals onto fields to forage cover crops after their market crops are harvested. Something I've been hearing about in Iowa, and there's research being done at Penn State with this management. Is sort of interesting. The crop farmers are enjoying the benefit of the livestock depositing manure and urine to increase the fertility and microbiology of the soil. And then the livestock farmers get the benefit from having this extra nutrients that their animals are receiving from the cover crop. So it's kind of a win-win, and it's good for the farming community in general. Something to keep your eye out for, or to look into for your own business. The second thing, our animals are eating plants, create an active cycle of plant growth. There's strong root development, a diversity of soil microorganisms, aeration of the soil, increased water infiltration, and retention of soil are all benefits that are seen with properly managed grazing systems. The third thing, and Donna touched on this, is just the active awareness of farmers by moving the fencing and moving their animals on the grazing systems. You're just out there and spending time on your pastures and seeing what's happening in this environment. You're just much more aware of what's happening in the fields. I like to use the line insight and underfoot equals in mind and being managed. And this is so true when you're doing an active pasturing system. One thing that I do suggest, if you're an owner or manager that has employees, that you train your employees. If they're the ones that are moving the fences and the animals, they need to be aware of changes in the pastures, changes with the animals, and they need to report that back to you. And this is something that our Capital RC&D Grazing Advisors can help you with if you need just to have a better understanding of what's going out there on the soil and the pastures, and then also helping to train your employees. We can try to help out with some of those things with your farm business. So these, again, soil health, there's so much to this, and Donna touched on some, I've touched on a little bit, but there's so much that we're not going to be able to cover with this webinar, but just to let you know that we are available to help you for those things. Okay, next slide, please. Positive environmental impact. So livestock on properly managed pasture and forage areas enhance the soil health. A good rotation of pastures with animals moving frequently minimizes time that animals spend in one area and evenly distributes manure and urine. This is a positive for the environment. And as we learn more and more about soil, or seeing what's happening above is super critical for what's happening underneath, learning more about the microorganisms and root development and things like this. And as we see with a properly managed, properly rotated pasturing system, it's a great benefit for both the animals as well as the soil and your overall farm environment and community environment. Excuse me. Also, foraging livestock can be used to reduce invasive species growth, particularly looking at goats browsing in areas. And looking holistically at your farm environment and incorporating aspects of silvopasture, which is involving woodlands and things of this nature, you can add benefits for the soil, animals, and your farm business. Secondly, with proper pasture forage conditions, create less erosion and soil runoff. Plant residue reduces rain splatter, causing impact on soil. Well-developed plant roots hold soil in place, and plants in general that are managed properly in a pasturing situation, it can hold the soil and reduce wind erosion. And if you're spending any time outside today or last evening, you know that the winds can get pretty strong here in the springtime particularly. So it's important that you treat your pasture for all year round. And we talked a bit about the reduction of manure concentration, again, with a proper rotation on animal movement. We like to see smaller paddocks and more frequent moving of the animals to reduce the manure concentration. And lastly, as far as environmental impact, carbon sequestration. It's a bit of a buzzword right now, but it's certainly an important aspect to consider with being farmers. Their USDA NRCS has a web tool called Comet Planner, cometplanner.com. And it's a fun tool. It gives the approximate carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emission reductions for changes in agricultural management practices, including grazing. So it's a fun tool. You put in your county, your acres, and a couple other information, and you will get out some information on how much carbon sequestration is happening on your property. So it's kind of a fun tool, and I think it's something that has a lot of future use. So these are some of the many benefits with having livestock grazing in a properly designed and managed forage pasture system. I hope you can consider some of these when looking to enhance your farm business. So I'm going to look now at, next please. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some key indicators that help is needed. Donna talked about some of these with soil and pasture management. So looking specifically at livestock issues, if you're seeing poor animal health or parasite issues, that is an indication that some help is needed. Particularly with sheep, goats, horses, parasites can really cause some problems. So if you're seeing some of this as far as like unthriftiness of your animals, poor hair coat, some anemic conditions regarding like the whites of their gums or under the eyelid, then it's indicating some parasite issues. You need to consult your veterinarian, but also you could bring one of our grazing advisors on board to try to look at your pastures and give you some advice on that. Also low animal productivity. If your bulk tank's not holding the amount of milk you want it to hold, or not the tank, but your animals aren't producing enough for your bulk tank. And then also if your field to finish days are not quite what you want to be, perhaps there's some work that can be done in your pasture, managing the different forages and all in your pastures that can help with your productivity. Low quality products. As a cheesemaker, I'm certainly well aware of the various milk components, fat and protein levels, your flavor components. These are really all important for your quality of your products. And if you're seeing some of these benchmarks not where you want them to be, that is an indicator that some maybe need another set of eyes or another brain to help you look through your pasture management. And as we have talked about with animals congregating, areas of creating manure concentration, this is something that we don't want to see. There's so many other ways of handling your animals and your pastures that if you're seeing this manure concentration, please contact the Capital RC&D or some of the other grazing advising resources and get some help. So I am going to hand it over now to Cheryl, who's going to help share some of the resource information. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann, and thanks, Donna. So you may already be familiar with other organizations or agencies that provide support for farmers and grazers. And of course, everyone has their own acronym. And after a while, it becomes what we call alphabet soup. It can be overwhelming to remember who does what. So during the next few minutes, I'm going to highlight a few key agencies that may be the most beneficial for grazers. At the end of the webinar, we'll share a handout that lists each of these agencies, their roles, specific programs for grazers, and how to access their resources. At the local level, county conservation districts assist farmers and landowners in addressing a variety of natural resource issues, including stormwater and conservation planning. With the exception of Philadelphia, every county within Pennsylvania has a conservation district, but individual county efforts may vary based on local needs. So programs with specific interests for grazers may vary by county. There's also county conservation districts or conservation districts maybe by region in other states throughout the United States. PDA, or the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, has resources for agricultural production too, including farmland preservation, marketing, and the Bureau of State Animal and Health Diagnostic Services, which includes the state veterinarians and details about animal diseases. So we have some great resources. Other state agencies that you should be aware of include PADEP, which is the Department of Environmental Protection, and PA-DCNR, or the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Neither offers programs specifically for grazing, but DEP sets requirements for manure management, and DCNR has programs for riparian and stream buffers. Two federal agencies providing direct support and technical assistance for farmers and grazers include the USDA FSA and which is the USDA Farm Service Agency. I was about to slip into the alphabet soup, and the USDA NRCS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service. FSA provides support through risk management like crop insurance and lending support for farm ownership and through operating loans. They also provide financial assistance for some conservation programs. FSA and NRCS offices are often co-located in the same county offices because they work so closely together. But NRCS offers more technical assistance and planning to implement conservation practices. NRCS is a key agency for grazers because they have grazing specialists that can provide funding and technical support for grazing planning, management, rotation, infrastructure, and general conservation. Each grazing specialist is tied to a different region within the state. Between those specialists and Capital RC&D's grazing advisors, grazers throughout the state have access to support. Grazing advisors and grazing specialists sound similar, but something that may help in understanding the difference is that grazing advisors provide farmer-to-farmer support, while the grazing specialists really provide agency to farmer support. They both have, familiar functions, similar functions, and they're very familiar with the work of each other, often collaborating to get projects done and to provide support for the farmer. So if a collaboration should be considered, if you're working with a grazing advisor and they feel that a grazing specialist may be able to provide additional information, vice versa, they won't hesitate to make that recommendation. In addition to the grazing specialists, NRCS staff can write conservation plans and, when appropriate, provide infrastructure development support for fencing, laneways, heavy use facilities, water access, and many other different support elements. Next. Next slide. In addition to governmental agencies, there are several organizations providing support and resources. First is Penn State Cooperative Extension, which provides educational programs and information about a variety of topics within agriculture and forestry, including grazing, pasture management, forages, cover crops, animal health, and marketing. Much of the information is available on the Extension website, but I want to specifically mention their use of teams. For example, agronomy, dairy, and field and forage all have individual teams. Each team includes researchers and extension educators with specific knowledge in the team topic. I wanted to mention this specifically because it can be helpful when searching for information based on that team topic. I've included a link to an About Us page that breaks down the areas covered through Extension in the handout that we'll provide. And if you can't find information about a topic, you can contact county extension offices and they'll be able to direct you to an appropriate educator. PASA Farming is a nonprofit organization providing support and education for farmers throughout Pennsylvania. Pasture walks, educational events, and the annual conference almost always have topics appropriate for grazers. And finally, PAGLC, or the Pennsylvania Grazing Lands Coalition, is a nonprofit that focuses on providing education and support specifically for grazers in Pennsylvania. They publish the Grazers Grapevine podcast and provide support to regional and local grazing groups that host field days and educational events. Southwest Project Grass is a regional group operating in the southwest part of the state. And Franklin, Lebanon, and Lancaster grazing groups host events in their own specific counties. Before we wrap up and open for questions, I'd like to thank our presenters, Donna and Ann, for taking time out of their schedule to share their knowledge, and to thank those participating live, as well as those who may be watching the recording. Thank you. As a reminder, details about the Grazing Advisor program and other resources, including the recording, handouts from the webinar, and other materials, are all available at capitalrcd.org. Next week, we'll host our second grazing webinar, Pasture, the Balancing Act, which will be presented by Titus Martin. It will provide detailed information about assessing livestock nutritional needs and the capacity of available pastures. We'll also focus on methods available to minimize a forage or nutritional shortage, such as stockpiling. And with that, I'd like to open for questions. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and we'll make sure that it's directed to the appropriate person. And I see here we do have a question. How do you sample soil and what is the cost?
Want me to take that one? This is Donna.
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. The best way to sample soil is to use an auger, which is it's a tube that has a tip that can penetrate soil pretty easily, and it will give you take out a core. In a pasture, generally I like to do at least 12 samples per acre. You don't want to take just one area. We've learned that pastures can vary greatly, especially if they're sloped, with nutrient levels in different parts of the pasture. So you want to take multiple samples. You want to take them in a W pattern generally, so you're covering the whole pasture. And the depth should be the depth of the grass forages, because you want to take that soil sample from the area where the plants are taking the nutrients. If you don't want to invest in a soil sampler, you can try your extension offices. Your conservation districts sometimes have them. NRCS probably has some, might let you borrow them, take them home, sample your soils, and then bring the sampler back. You can use a shovel. It's a little bit harder because you tend to get a lot of grass, worms, insects, things that you have to take out of the sample. Price-wise, generally, I don't know where the person asking the question is from. Penn State's costs are about $10 for a soil sample. And you basically are buying a kit that has a bag that you mail out to the university. You send your sample out, they evaluate it, and they send the recommendations and the results back to you. There are different analytical laboratories all throughout the state and all throughout the country, actually. So you can probably use their resources as well to get a good, accurate sample of your soil.
Thanks, Donna.
Yes, one thing I should say very quickly that I think is important is people like to have small paddocks, like 30 pastures on a farm. It's not always necessary to sample each one differently. That can get cost prohibitive. But if you have pastures that basically have been managed the same way, applied fertilizer the same at the same time, where you want to take separate samples, as one was a cornfield and now it's a pasture, one was a soybean field, they were handled differently. It's good to get baseline information on what the soil fertility is in those paddocks separately, but it's not necessary if they've been treated the same.
Thank you.
No, I'll chime in here too, please, and say, this is Ann, with the RC&D Grazing Advisors, we can help do the soil sampling. So if that's something that you would like to help us with, just give us a call or contact us, and we can come out and help with the soil sampling.
That's a good idea. And even, you know, as I was envisioning that, even if it's just setting up a standard protocol, walking you through what it should look like when you do that, where the best places are. That could be very helpful. Thank you. Another question we have is, can you recommend a good resource for grass and weed identification?
I'll start. I'm sure Ann has some as well. As silly as this may sound, one of my best resources is a book called Weeds of the Northeast. And you might be asking, well, why would they have grass in there? But grasses in a cornfield are considered to be a weed. And I happen to really like that. They have great pictures of grasses at all stages of development. Sometimes you want to identify them when they're very small, and you need to look at plant parts like ligules and hairs on the leaves. And I think it's a good basic resource to get you started. It's got everything from Timothy orchard grass to all the foxtails, crabgrasses, switchgrass, they're all in that Weeds of the Northeast. At the same time, in the same reference book, you have all the major weeds in this area with great photographs, again, of what they look like when they're tiny, just coming out of the ground, and what they look like when they're mature weeds. So that's really good. There's a lot of great websites. Cornell has one. Kentucky has some great websites on pasture forages. Penn State does. And there are some other really good references as well. And Susan, I believe we're going to put those on the RC&D website, correct? Or Cheryl?
Ken?
I think we were going to generate a list of good references to help identify forages and make those available on this website, right?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'll try to do that in the next week or two. So check back and I'll list all my favorite resources and ones that will help you a lot. Some are very complex. There are good keys that you can follow to identify weeds. It's fun. So you can always call me too, and I'd be happy to help you over the phone.
It looks like we have another question, and it's, we've just bought a farm that was a dairy. The pastures are all grown up with grass and weeds. How should we go about taking care of these pastures? The pastures are all sloped and will be difficult to mow or reseed.
I didn't catch, did she talk about or he talk about what livestock species they're putting on there?
No, that wasn't included.
I'm going to ask Ann to chime in on this one too, but if they're heavily sloped, I'm hoping they're not sloped so much that you can't mow, because mowing would be very important. And the other thing is, again, identification, get help, ask a grazing advisor to come out or contact somebody in your area, because I don't know if the people answering these questions are even from Pennsylvania, but you need to know what's there. You need to know, are they annual grasses? What kind of grasses are they? What kind of weeds are they? Are they toxic? Are those weeds annuals or perennials? Because you're going to deal with them separately. But hopefully at least mowing is a really good way, and keeping animals off for a while to let those pastures reestablished. I've seen some pretty poor pastures that just by resting them and mowing to keep those annual weeds from going to seed and trying to hurt some of the root reserves of the perennial weeds goes a long ways towards making it better.
And if I could chime in, yes, I got a response, and they're planning to run cows and sheep.
Okay, all right.
I can join in here some too. And as far as the animals with the cows and the sheep, I mean, if they, depending on what the slope is, and you know, you have to be careful with cows in sloped areas that they don't tromp it down too much. But sheep would be, you know, good on maybe the steeper sloped areas. And again, it, like Donna was saying, it depends on how the pastures are going to get taken care of regarding the keeping that sod in place and things of that nature.
And I think if you do reseed, choose a species that's sod forming, because if it's sloped, you don't want to put something in there, grass that's maybe not going to handle intense grazing, that's a bunch type grass that isn't going to send out rhizomes. You want to choose something that's more sod forming so that it's going to be able to hold that soil back and prevent erosion. But it's probably going to be a challenge if it's depending on how steep it is.
Thanks, Donna.
I think too, a combination of grasses. I shouldn't say this, I guess, but I'm not a terribly big proponent of bluegrass. It doesn't yield a whole lot, but it's used for athletic fields for a reason. It takes trampling, it takes hard use. It goes dormant in the summer, so that's negative, but it's going to form a solid and help hold soil in those areas that maybe are steep and are going to generate erosion. And again, a combination of forage species, because if it's not perfect for one, something that's better adapted to those soil conditions might take hold and survive. So I would be looking, if you're going to reseed, of a mixture that's got some sod forming grasses like bluegrass and some higher yielding grasses like orchard grass, festilolium, a fescue, that might give you better growth in the summertime, but utilize a mixture. Probably not Timothy. It's not drought tolerant. It's got shallow roots anyway. It's not going to do well in a situation like that, but choose that forage carefully.
We'll include, I'm going to send a link to the Comet Planner in the chat, just in case anyone wants to check that out. We'll also have that on the website, and it looks like an interesting resource. Are there any other questions? Well, if there are no additional questions, we can go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Once again, I'd like to thank our presenters, Donna Foulk and Ann Basehore, as well as those participating again live or via recording. We appreciate your time and hope that you found this valuable. Please feel free to contact us with any questions about the grazing support or the Grazing Advisor program, or visit capitalrcd.org for more information. Thank you.